we're very happy that you all joined us today for discussion and some insightful insights on how we're looking at managing public finances and our approach, as well as having panelists talk about how the approach lands, what else should we be thinking about, drawing on their experience of connecting the dots between this approach and how they have looked at public finance over the years. So this is largely what we'll be covering today, where I'll quickly take us through the organization, the team that has been working on this, as well as moderator Ameya, who will then go on to introducing the panelists, as well as taking us all through how we've thought of the strategy and approach to reimagining public financial management. There'll be a discussion with the panelists, and we'll close with some questions from the audience. Yeah.
Go to the next slide.
Great. So eGov, we've been around for over 2 decades now. We were founded in 2003 by a few visionaries such as Nandan Nilekani, Shrikant Nadamuni, and also supported as the founder trustee member, Professor V. Sadagopan. We actually have been in the line of partnering with local governments, the market actors, civil service organizations, etc., to see how we can use technology as the key to unlock a lot of governance challenges to deliver better citizen services. And how we do this is basically we work with marketplace actors, work with the governments and civil society organizations. We build DPIs, we enhance their capacity on these technology solutions, as well as catalyze the market ecosystem to come together to provide more transparent, equitable, and sustainable public services for all. And the large digital public infrastructure that sort of acts as the foundation for us to be able to do all of this is the Digit platform that we've developed. Next slide. With the Digit platform, we've actually been able to, and I'll get to that a little bit in detail in the next slide, but with the Digit platform, what we've been able to do so far is across these 3 key pillars of building digital public infrastructure that acts as the rails, and then on top of that, we can build more and more solutions and technology to be able to deliver better services to citizens. And we enhance state capacity, so we work with governments to ensure that they're equipped to own and manage their digital transformation journey. And we also catalyze the market ecosystem by bringing them in to innovate on top of the platform, the core platform that we have. So through this, what we've been able to do is we're currently working on 8 different sectors, contributing to multiple different SDGs. 4 of them are actually driven by us, and we've been working with partners to drive for more domains as well. More than 10 countries, different subnational governments who we're working with, close to 2 billion citizens served, close to 2 billion revenue mobilized for different governments. So the key message here is that across different domains, working with different set of stakeholders, we've been able to use one common digital public infrastructure to be able to do all of this. And of course, a lot of this has been possible thanks to generous support from our partners, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ameya Network, Tata Trust, Nandan Nilekani Philanthropies, and the Global Fund. Yeah. Digit platform itself, which we've been talking about, has the common rail to be able to address complex or wicked problems across different domains, actually has been used for multiple such sectoral use cases. The same platform is actually solving for different problems, such as managing health campaigns in a global context, transforming urban governance at national scale in India. We're also using that to help build fiscal resilience in urban and rural local bodies in a few subnational governments, working on frictionless, timely benefits delivery for the urban poor. We're also working on legal case management, sanitation, and even vaccine certificates being distributed. So all of this is done through our work with different governments, markets, and nonprofits, and coming to deliver transformation at population scale. Yeah. At the PFM mission in eGov, So what we've been looking at for the past two decades is how urban service delivery happens and how we can transform that. And in the process, what we've realized that a lot of these challenges also owe to some of the operational bottlenecks in the process, where funds are not moving in time to be able to deliver services in time. So the mission, the PFM mission, or the Public Financial Management mission at eGov, aims to drive transformative change by leveraging the digital public infrastructure that we have, the platform, and also making associated policy reforms and driving ecosystem participation. So our focus largely is on trying to see how we can solve some of these operational transactional challenges, such as funds not moving in time, or the dichotomy of actually having unutilized funds in one place and not having enough funds on the other side, as well as challenges around data fidelity, availability of data itself, and things like administrative burdens. This is largely what drove us to sort of look at how we could move past these challenges and help governments deliver services in a more robust, functional, and responsive way. So we work on improving the financial health of governments, facilitating real-time seamless information exchange electronically to all actors to be able to actually deliver responsive service delivery for all. I will quickly move on to introducing our moderator for this evening. So we have with us Ameya Ashok Naik, who is from our Policy and Research Impact Unit at eGov. Ameya works on mapping the potential applications of our approach to PFM itself, of the events-based approach that we have developed to different sectoral use cases. Ameya also works on developing and supporting the implementation of eGov's data protection and privacy frameworks, as well as our monitoring and evaluation process. Ameya is an alumnus from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, as well as Mumbai University, and is a faculty fellow at the Takshashila Institution, where he runs courses on policy analysis. Ameya, over to you.
Great, thanks, Prashant. Thank you also for introducing all of us to the work that eGov is doing and the work that the PFM mission is doing. What I will do now is, first of all, introduce our panelists to the audience. After that, I'll do a quick talk through or overview of the strategy and approach. So how eGov is thinking about reimagining PFM. And then we'll move on to the panel discussion itself. During the overview and during the panel discussion, if anyone in the audience has question, please feel free to put those into the Q&A box. And equally, I would welcome the panelists. I think you all are all co-hosts and you should be able to see the Q&A section. So if you either want to flag something as something to be taken up live in your comments, or if you want to go ahead and type in a response, please go ahead. We hope to keep this interactive. So starting with our panel, we are delighted to be joined today by Lorena Rivero del Paso, Avani Kapur, and Cathal Long. I'll do the intros in the order that they will be speaking as well. So Lorena is a PFM advisor with the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. She specializes in budget execution, program and performance budgeting, transparency, and use of digital tools for PFM and governance. Before joining the IMF, she was manager at the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, and before that, General Director of Performance Budget at the Ministry of Finance of Mexico. She holds a jointly awarded MSc in Law and Economics from the University of Bologna and the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research of India, and an LLM from the University of Hamburg. Lorena, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Then we're joined by Avani Kapur. Avani is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and leads the Accountability Initiative, which has been working, and she has been working for over 12 years in researching governance, state capacity, and public finance. She anchors the annual budget brief series, which those of you who follow budgets and budget analysis in India will no doubt be familiar with. This is a series which analyzes the performance of key welfare programs of the government of India. She has also led several research projects on key social sector schemes such as health, nutrition, water, sanitation, and education. The way Avani and I know each other, in fact, dates back to one of the early reports that they did on education almost more than a decade ago now. Avani is an alumna of the London School of Economics and of Smith College. Avani, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are joined by Cathal Long. Cathal is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, where he co-leads the Digital Public Finance Hub. His research looks at local government financing for service delivery. He also advises government on PFM reforms as part of ODI's advisory services. Cathal was, in fact, an ODI fellow, the signature fellowship program of ODI. He was an ODI fellow in Swaziland and is a graduate of the University College of Dublin and a member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. Cathal, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So with that, let me move to my opening presentation. As I said, I'll be talking through our approach as documented in this strategy blueprint or blue book. I'm going to also quickly switch my screen to show you all where you can access. So if you go to the eGov PFM website, which is pfm.digit.org, and I'll request Prashant to put the URL into chat as well, and navigate to the strategy and approach tab, you will be able to access the strategy blueprint from here. You can actually read it on the microsite itself, or you can choose to download it, and you will get a PDF copy that you can go through. We will put those links into chat. We will also share those again on our final slide. And we'll be sharing them again when we put out the recording of the webinar. We do encourage you to go through and read and get back to us with any ideas, any comments, any feedbacks, any opportunities for collaboration. That's really the primary goal of this exercise. So with that, let me move forward with the overview. At the risk of starting in a somewhat basic or simplified space, are the slides visible? Okay, just give me a second. Slides visible now? Great. Thanks, everyone. So again, at the risk of starting in a slightly simplified place, but simply to establish context, right? Any government has to raise revenues. It has only so many avenues for raising those revenues. It then has to decide through its own policy-making procedures and apparatus how it is going to allocate and spend that money. It then has to, in fact, spend that money in ways that create public goods, public services, or promote social welfare. So with this very basic background again, we've been looking at what it is that different actors within government actually do in order to achieve all of these steps and processes, and what sort of challenges come up when they attempt to do so. And in short, the challenge is that there is a great complexity of actors, each of whom needs specific information to make specific decisions that in turn will affect how that money is raised, how it is allocated, whether it is in fact expended as planned at the time that was planned, in ways that will in fact secure the outcomes that it was meant to achieve, right? If you are someone who works inside this system, some of this might look familiar to you, right? You may be familiar with the challenges and the frustrations of trying to get data out of multiple different systems at the time that you need it to make a specific decision. You may also be familiar with the need to maintain multiple parallel records, sometimes including paper records, because those are required for process tracing or accountability, or simply because when a digital system has been introduced, it doesn't immediately follow that there is high trust in it and it's going to be used right out the gate. And even if you've had to interact with some of these systems as a resident or a citizen or a user or a vendor, you may in fact have taken some of the work of solving these coordination challenges onto yourself and basically made sure that the right information is available with the right decision maker because you provided it to them, as opposed to it coming from necessarily inside the system itself. And you may also have experienced the sorts of delays and challenges that arise when this information is in fact not available. So again, we think of this as the pivotal problem, right? How can the right information be available with the right person at the right time in a way that they can make sense of it and act on it within the broader context of their institution and their processes? Many people are trying to solve this. In many cases, we've seen civil servants or officials within government or other innovators figure out what is needed within the specific context that they're working, and to say, okay, we'll figure out, we'll create our own systems, we'll rework our own processes in ways that make sure that we have that information at the time that we need it. This definitely helps. It does make things in those specific contexts work better. But it raises a new challenge, which is that if you wanted an integrated view across all of these different verticals, there are now a growing number of systems that are in use that may or may not actually speak the same language, as it were. That is, they may not be handling the same data in the same ways, they may not be defining the same data in the same ways. And you potentially have to be able to integrate n into n minus 1 systems, right? It's almost a factorial problem. And again, it comes down to individuals, whether citizens or administrators or civil servants, to actually thread this and to be able to get the data that they need. It might be slightly easier if it's available in a particular vertical system, but it's still not quite the level of interoperability and visibility that we hope to see. And so this is the question we asked ourselves. And this is really how we're thinking about digital PFM, right? We said, can we build a common digital platform or a digital highway, if you will, where different systems and different actors are treating data in the same ways, therefore speaking the same language? They can actually trust the origin and the provenance of that data and therefore be willing to act upon it. And if there is standardized data that is reliable, available to them at the time that they need to act on it, then that should actually increase the velocity at which public funds move through these systems. So more funds can reach the particular frontline that they are supposed to reach in a shorter amount of time, leading to accelerated development outcomes, whether that's in terms of infrastructure, whether that's in terms of service delivery, or whether that's in terms of social welfare and benefits. And all of this can be underpinned by a common digital platform, which incorporates both the capabilities to exchange the data, as well as the common data directory or the common understanding of what a particular piece of data means. The building block of this approach is what we call standardized fiscal events. So think of this as the particular message that is being sent between any two entities in this sort of complex system that you saw. On the fiscal side, we've actually done a fair bit of work to go through the different kinds of information and messages that get exchanged. And we currently believe that a substantial majority of these can be modeled as these 9 types of standardized events that you see on the screen, namely estimate, plan, sanction, demand, receipt, credit, bill, payment, debit. Each such event would carry specific information that others could use and act upon at various stages of the PFM lifecycle. So whether it is someone who has to actually allocate or release a certain amount of funds, or whether it's someone who has to account for it, or someone who has to go back and audit those records later, the information that they need in order to be able to perform their function can be neatly encoded into this kind of event. What this enables when you have standardized fiscal events and a data exchange platform is that across a federal system, across multiple different departments, it is possible for actors and entities to exchange, again, the key information that they need to make the decisions that will influence expenditure and in turn development. It also unlocks a number of capabilities, because when you have that reliable standardized data to work upon, you can start looking at improving forecasting, getting a better sense of fiscal sustainability of a given entity or a given scheme. You can start trying to identify and monitor specific risks or liabilities or categories of risks or liability. If you think about the accounting and audit side, what this data also enables is improved anomaly detection, which could potentially assist an auditor in realizing that there is a particular area where they need to focus their attention. There are other potential use cases as well, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward on this one. Just to say, we welcome, again, comments, feedback, questions on this, and we look forward to continuing that discussion. 2 quick illustrations of where this is actually being used in India. So in the state of Punjab, there are inside the panchayat, inside the rural local body, an entity, a water and sewerage committee, that is responsible for maintaining the operational sustainability of any drinking water scheme, right? At the level of the individual village, they basically issue bills and collect funds. At the level of the state or the department, there is a need for visibility into the status of funding of all of these. Further, with the kind of expenditures that these departments incur, if there is a gap between the demand or the receipts that they're collecting and the kind of expenditures that they're actually having to incur to keep the drinking water infrastructure and supply running, then those might not be apparent in real time, especially again at the level of the state or the department. And what this usually ends up meaning in practice is that the department is faced with surprise bills. As a result, what we have done working with the Department of Drinking Water in Punjab is to actually operationalize a front end where the water and sewerage committees can enter this information about expenditures, demand, revenues, and then using the iFix platform, consolidated that into fiscal dashboards that the finance department, the water department, other administrators can use to get a sense of where they stand on revenues and expenditures, and therefore on the fiscal sustainability of the local body when it comes to these drinking water schemes. In the future, we believe this can also enable real-time auditing because all of the information that an auditor would need is in some sense available already. A second quick illustration, and this is also my last slide. Odisha is a state in India that has introduced a urban employment guarantee scheme called the Mukta scheme, where they are offering wage seekers a certain minimum number of paid work days on projects that are determined by local bodies or other community organizations as priorities for the local area. The challenge there is that between the community-based organizations who are running these schemes and the ULB, the amount of coordination needed further up the line with state scheme departments as well tends to mean that workers actually are getting paid with delays. And if you think about the kind of person who is likely to sign up for a scheme like this, timely payment is a great priority for them. And so again, working with the state government, what we've done is we have helped them standardize the kind of information that is exchanged about any such project, such that once the community-based organization or supervisor has submitted information on who the workers are who are working on a particular project, and once that has been verified by the relevant stakeholder in the ULB, the process of getting the payment released to all of those workers is considerably expedited, right? That's basically a single approval that has to go to at that point of time. And then because all of those particular recipients are already enumerated and registered, a payment can go straight through to them. And so persons such as those that you see in the image working on a particular local project can receive their payments in a much more expedited manner. With that, let me now turn to the panel itself. Again, you will find links for the strategy and approach in the chat, and you will see them again at the end of these slides. We welcome your questions and feedback. Moving on to the panel, let me first invite Lorena. We had the pleasure of hearing from you earlier in the year as well. And one of the things that you mentioned there was that the way that efforts at standardization are going, at some point, we're also going to need a standard of standards that cuts across all of these. And so we would love to hear your thoughts on what does the standardization process look like? What are some things that can be targeted in that? And also your thoughts on how an event-based approach might play into this. Lorena, over to you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I am very excited to be here with you. I prepared some slides to guide through some of the things, and as Ameya was just mentioning, we were talking about this and the standard of standards and how we need to also discuss the same languages to also improve, because if we want interoperability to happen, then we also need to speak the same languages, right? So, and I think this will link very well with a couple of things that I prepared for context. And that is going to link with what Ameya was just mentioning. First of all, one of the things he was mentioning is when we don't have the information, then some champions have started to develop systems, right? And what we see here, and I'm going to give you the international trend, systems availability for budget execution and accounting is not really an issue, right? We find that 193 countries of the 197 countries that were surveyed have systems, have FMIS, which is budget execution and account. Okay, we're fine, we're sort of fine. Then if we break it down of what PFM functions are covered internationally, and this starts reflecting a lot more on what your findings of eGov in India, is you might have the budget and accounting, but if we go and drill down into the PFM functions that are covered by the systems, then we don't have the same coverage. For example, if you want to link with seeing how public works are going, then public investments management, do we have systems for that? And we here see that from the 197, only 77 have public investments management systems. Now, this is about availability and coverage, and we're not talking about the quality. Now, when we talk about the quality, we had a survey, we had some piloting with 30 countries this year, at the beginning of this year. And the point that comes across as the most relevant of concern to the countries is, guess what? Lack of connectivity and interoperability. And this is across the three regions, both in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America. So this is the concern that's happening in the minds of ministries of finance from the national level. And we are not touching here subnational governments, which is even further when we talk about the amount of systems that are involved here. We have other concerns, but today, considering the focus of IFEX and the sharing of information, I would say, let's focus on lack of connectivity, interoperability, but also the quality of data and the conflicting data with other systems that are still in the top 5, right? We count that. Then what is going on with this blue book and how do we fix that? It's exactly the core of the problem that countries are trying to achieve. Now, I'm going to present how we are thinking about this as well. We have just presented the digital solutions guidelines for PFM that you saw in the cover. But I'm going to do a zoom in into the data architecture element of this, because it's how can we rethink the systems and create this, let's say, digital public infrastructure, but on the data exchange layer, the codes, catalogs, and so forth. So the digital solutions guidelines are this framework based on pillars, 3 pillars, and it's a detailed practitioner's view of the desirable functional attributes for each of 11 PFM functions. So how does this look like? Very simple. It's 3 pillars. We have 6 principles per pillar and up to 4 attributes per principle. So in total, we have our 30 attributes, and then we break this down into 3 levels of maturity. So what are we trying to achieve with this? Helping governments see the systems that they have, analyze how they are, design new systems in a way that is much more structured. And guess what? One of these ones, and principle 3 here in the functional one, you're going to find data architecture and interoperability, where we look at codes and catalogs. So I'm going to get to the events, the data structure, and how we exchange data. Which systems would need to exchange data with what, so that functions are covered completely. Just to note that this is not done unilaterally. This was done with several countries, several consultations and piloting with more than 30 countries in different regions. So here we capture what is going on around the world. And as they mentioned, this has been applied, the digit, in 10 countries, and that is because there is a similar structure as well. I'm going to focus right now, this zoom in into the data architecture and interoperability that are inside of the functional pillar. As I mentioned, each of the attributes has 3 levels of maturity. And here we have for the process transformation, data capture. And here we go for the foundational, intermediate, and advanced for the data architecture and interoperability. So here we would look at how we would see an advanced level of maturity for different functions of PFM. And this is so that governments can also see where their system stands. Usually the problems are very basic, that the codes and catalogs are updated in one system and then not updated in the other one, for example. Or we see that the data structure, we get lots of PDFs when it comes, for example, with procurement or public investments, and then analyzing the data is something that we cannot finally do. And then this ends up in a poor data exchange. We don't have APIs to share the data. We don't have web services and so forth. So this is where the work that this eGov publication comes into play. So as I was saying, we have much more interoperability between budget execution and treasury management, the FMIS, but we also have other systems to actually get to the service delivery. And that is what we're trying to get here. And we would like to actually see not this, but this, right? We would like to see the exchange of data and also that this is transparent. Here we have the dissemination portals on the right side, the internal audit, fiscal risks management, and so forth. And the accounting, of course, is the one that receives all this data. How do we achieve this? Here is just for reference that we have for the 6. Now, the PFM functions that are covered in the guidelines are 11, as I was just mentioning, but here we have a zoom in for what is more in play on the blue book, and it's the fiscal forecasting and budget preparation. What I want to bring up is this events approach, how it links to the sub-functions that we have established here in the guidelines. And as you can see here, it's very easy to map from the planning, the demand, and the bill that is mentioned. So we have here this sub-functions of the budget execution and the budget preparation. Now, one thing that we do additionally on these guidelines is to make this table that I mentioned of the levels of maturity specific for each of these sub-functions. So what data should be exchanged? And here the one you're seeing is commitment. So the stage of the commitment of the sub-function, what systems would need to exchange data. So here we see, with procurement, you need to exchange much more data and so forth. So this links very well with what you have been saying on how do we get this data for actionable stuff. Here, this is just for reference because I know you're going to distribute the slides so you can have all the levels of maturity of the IT architecture and governance and management. Why I leave this is because it's important to note that one thing, you can't look at one thing unilaterally. You need to look at the whole structure from the architectural, functional, and governance and management perspective, because sometimes the problem with the data is that we don't have data governance, which is in the governance and management. So if we just look at the goals and catalogs, we might be missing something. Or we might have a problem with the IT architecture that it's not user-centric and therefore they don't capture the data correctly, which is also a common case. Just to mention, we have developed a tool that is also called DIGIT, which is not the same DIGIT. This is an acronym of Digital Solutions Implementation Tool. And this is how it looks to give a level of maturity of the systems on these different elements. So just here linking very much on what the work of eGov and these Blue Book are doing. So hopefully this shows how this is linking to what is going also internationally on this site.
Great, thanks so much, Lorena. We noticed when you shared the draft that we landed on the same acronyms. But I'm going to say also reflective of similar underlying thinking, which I would take as a good sign. With that, let me tag in Avani. So Avani, as I was saying earlier, this is a field that you've been working in for close to a decade. You've actually experienced on-ground, hands-on, the challenges of getting the right data for analysis or for decision-making. And so again, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what does that sort of information flow look like in India? what could it look like? Would an event-based approach fit into that, and how? Over to you.
Thanks, Ameya. Listening to you as well as getting the privilege of reading the PFM Blue Book, I was reminded of the time when me and my colleagues had visited a district office in a state, and we had collected digitized soft copies of the utilization of funds for India's National Health Mission. So the file name was dated 31st March. And we thought that that was in some ways going to give us a true picture of the total quantum of funds spent by the district on the National Health Mission. A few weeks later, another colleague of mine visited the same office for some other information and ended up getting on a pen drive that same file. This time also it was dated as 31st March. But there was a difference of several lakhs of rupees in terms of the total amount that was stated as what had been utilized. When we pointed this out to the district, no one in the office could explain the reason for this difference, nor were they actually sure about which was the more accurate number. And this challenge of fragmented nature of information is in some ways been our bread and butter at the Accountability Initiative. We, in fact, complete 15 years in a few days. And part of it has been just trying to piece together, almost like a jigsaw puzzle, the differences between proposed budgets and approved budgets and allocations, releases, expenditures, and outputs. And we've been doing this for key central schemes, as you said, during the annual budget analysis, but also trying to do this very difficult task. Particularly, we started in 2008. Now you have a lot more systems, and as you said rightly, there are a lot more innovations, and you have treasuries online, you have budgets online, which were in 2009 not a scenario that existed, of actually trying to track that government file and money right from when Government of India releases it till the bank account of the household or the school. Or also trying to understand fiscal marksmanship, which is present often in most of the budgeting in India. And I think I can safely say that we've honed several fiscal detectives, as we call them, trying to unpack the data and workflows. So I think that the blue paper does a great job in trying to understand and map out the different fiscal events and both the challenges and the opportunities in India's current PFM architecture and design. I think what I particularly liked was the fact that you've taken into account actors at different levels, and you kind of talk about how in some ways you need an integrated system and not some of these piecemeal interventions. But as someone who's spent a lot of time in government offices as well as with frontline workers, I end up putting on my policy hat, or rather the implementation hat. And I do see some challenges, not to say that they aren't resolvable, but just to say that it's something that we should keep in mind as we're thinking through how to actually build a system like this. And I think the first one that I see, which again is an opportunity as well, is that for this to be truly successful, and when I'm saying truly successful, I like the fact that we're not thinking of PFM as a reform in itself, but it's leading to better service delivery, it's leading to a certain outcome. Is that in some ways you need a lot of reforms happening together. It can't be just ensuring not just the vertical integration, as you mentioned, but it also requires different actors to come together. So one of the things that I think something that I've been advocating for in some of our work is how do you harmonize accounting standards across different levels? A few years ago, we done some work with the government of Karnataka at local body, looking at local government financing. And I think something as simple, which sounds simple as a location code, the absence of that means that you don't really have an idea of the level at which expenditure is being incurred. And we've been doing some exercises of trying to, as in, it's interesting, the district is such a strong implementing unit, but obviously it's not a governance level in India, so you don't have anything called a district budget. But looking at drawing and disbursing officers and looking at treasury data to try and look at how much does the district spend, and the answer to which no one really knows. Similarly, I think as a country, we don't have a number for how much does India spend on nutrition, because of the way that accounting standards exist. And so I think if you want to be able to have this common master data, you do need to reform the accounting standards. And that for me is an important almost foundation on which a lot of the information flows can be built. I think the other thing that's going to be interesting to see how this all comes to be is it's important to keep culture and people in mind. And I know that you do mention that, because a lot of this is going to be, or rather need, a trust building exercise. I think, Ameya, in one of your slides, which had that squiggly, the right people need to know that at the right time information. You spoke about the fact that often trust in the system is very low. But what I've also noticed in some of our work is that in a federal setup like India, there's also mistrust between different levels in the federal structure. I've had state governments complain about the union government not giving them data or not trusting the union government's data, as well as the union government sharing that states just haven't shared the requisite data with them. So it's not always the case that data doesn't exist. I think it's also about how open you are about your own data set, but also how open you are about trusting the data systems. And we've seen this mistrust happen even within state line departments. I'm not even talking about I think the hierarchical mistrust is, of course, very prevalent across many countries, but even within state line departments, we've actually been trying to kind of brokerage that mistrust sometimes to say that when different line departments aren't willing to share data across with each other. So I think this trust building exercise is going to be important in trying to make it work. I also think that, again, I think what's been great in terms of the open platform that you have all been building is that one of the things that I think everyone has written about is that you need to make the design iterative and flexible and responsive to user needs. And I think that's what's great about having more of an open data system that decentralizes and democratizes data. But I do think that we also need to take into account an understanding of user needs and incentives. It's partly linked to the trust aspect that I spoke about, but I also think that sometimes data systems are built where certain users' needs are deprioritized, and that can remain a barrier to full adoption. And similarly, I think the recognition that users aren't homogeneous, neither in their capacity nor in their ability to be comfortable with digital tools. We've seen even at the ministry level different capabilities in terms of digital. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we're thinking through this. So I guess people, culture, trust building are again some of the cornerstones that are going to assist in making an event-based system or actually see light. Having said that, I think as a theoretical exercise, and hopefully with chances of it actually being adopted, I think it would make all of our lives easier. Like I said, we've been advocating for paperless state, or actually trying to adopt digital, not just and in almost everything that you could do. I remember, I think one of our papers, we found like just at the state level, the file had to pass through 25 desks, which of course means that for the last mile, paper flows and money flows become difficult. But I guess what is going to be interesting to see is often a lot of PFM systems have spoken about a staggered approach, because the second you're trying to do very, very big bang reform, it can be quite daunting. But having said that, I do feel like it requires to some degree a big bang reform. And by that, what I mean is you need to actually get into the culture, you need to get into the changing rules and building that trust where you don't need the paper along with the digital. You don't need a system where you still need multiple people signing, even when the digital technology exists, because that's what their job is. You need who does the accountability lie with is something that requires a reimagination. So for me, that's going to be an interesting aspect going forward. But yeah, no, I think it's been. I think I've learned a lot from reading all these digital these efforts at digitalization, but also how do you create an integrated system that is not an end in itself, but actually trying to work towards a stronger outcome. So I'll pause here and we'll circle back later.
Thanks so much, Avani. And I think that's a great articulation of a digital system that's not an end in itself, but actually helping achieve multiple outcomes for multiple people in the system. Absolutely. With that, let me invite Cathal, who also has given us very helpful feedback on previous drafts of the book, helped us really streamline and tighten up many of the ideas in there. And let me tell the audience as well that we gave Cathal a fairly wide mandate. So we said, given your vantage point at ODI, given that you'll see what multiple governments are working with, tell us what the sort of top 3 challenges that people working in this space, say in a finance ministry or a treasury department, what do they say their top 3 challenges are? And again, do you think, or to what extent do you think an emancipation approach would get at some of those? So, Cathal, over to you. Feel free also to respond to things that Lorena and Avani have said. And in turn, we'll give them a chance to come back after and respond as well.
Sure. Thanks, Ameya, and thanks to the eGov Foundation for the invite today, and for all your collaborative efforts with the Digital Public Finance Hub at ODI over the last couple of years as well, which we really appreciate and we really look forward to continuing in the future. So as Ameya has mentioned, the brief I've been given is what do I think are the top 3 issues that finance ministries and PFM professionals are facing right now, and how the events-based approach we've been discussing might address or respond to some of these challenges. It's a big question, but it's quite a timely question, given that most governments are actually facing a similar set of challenges currently, which has been kind of dubbed the poly crisis. And it's also quite timely because we just had a conference in September here at ODI about how finance ministries are navigating this poly crisis. So what I've decided to do is to kind of share 3 of my takeaways from that conference that I think are relevant for the discussion today. So the first one is around the fiscal squeeze that most countries are facing at the moment, and everyone is looking to finance ministries on how they're going to solve this fiscal squeeze issue. Not a surprising theme for the conference, and there was a lot of consensus that fiscal consolidation is going to be a major theme for finance ministries for the next few years. And I mean, you can see that in almost everything that the IMF where Lorena works are producing at the moment. So finance ministries are going to be trying to raise more revenues, but they'll also be trying to prioritize expenditure, trying to balance short-term spending pressures with longer-term objectives like responding to growing inequality and climate change. And they're going to be doing this in the face of extreme uncertainty, as this poly crisis shows no signs of coming to an end, especially if you look at, what even since we did the conference, just look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine at the moment. So to do this, they're going to need good information to make very difficult decisions. And I think that's where PFM is important, and that's where digital PFM is particularly important. But, you know, almost every time I read something like a spending review or a piece of analysis on government expenditure, the opening part of the document almost always points to some limitations of the analysis due to issues with data. It's like, we couldn't really find the answer that you were looking for because we have problems like bringing together data on inputs, outputs, outcomes, quality of outputs. And that makes it very hard for any kind of decision maker in government to make a decision on what to cut, where and by how much, where to reallocate, like in terms of prioritization. And, you know, it's my hope that digital solutions and approaches like the ones we've been discussing can really go some way to addressing these problems we have of kind of bringing together data in meaningful ways so that you can get meaningful analysis and you can help decision makers make those tough decisions around prioritizing expenditure. So I see a lot of potential for this events-based approach to allow us to do things that we do now, but to do them better, particularly with respect to the quality of information we're putting in front of decision makers. So that's the first thing. I also see this events-based approach as part of a shift to a more open technology architecture where the PFM system is part of a wider ecosystem of data, platforms, and services. And I think that shift allows government to do new things. And I think one important thing that it can enable is to allow for spending to be more targeted. And it's never been more important for spending to become more targeted, particularly given kind of growing inequality issues across countries and within countries, but also in terms of making the most out of scarce resources right now at a time when we're in this fiscal squeeze. And I think by connecting data and delivery systems across government, we can get a better understanding of the needs of citizens and also find better ways of actually reaching them. And I think this could, you know, contribute to closing the gap between policy and delivery with respect to addressing inequality. And the final point, which is quite related to the second point that is around responsiveness. And I think this events-based approach could kind of contribute to more responsiveness on the part of governments. Thinking about issues of adaptation to climate change, which was a big discussion point of the conference as well, particularly in terms of, you know, balancing the short-term and long-term spending pressures. You know, countries are going to face an increase in the frequency and severity of these climate events. And responding to these events will actually require better data on those who are being affected by them, and also better data in order to reach them in terms of a response. And I think as well, particularly for countries that are resource constrained, having these kind of better delivery systems in place is, you know, an effective way of mobilizing resources from external funders, particularly as more kind of concessional financing moves towards climate change. So I'll leave it there for now. I didn't really get to respond to the other panelists, but I very much agree with all the points that they raised.
Thanks, Cathal. I think that was quite interesting. Just wanted to chip in with a little, just to build on top of what Carl said, Carl, what we also think of this approach is looking at finance ministries or finance departments in different parts of the world as the coordinators of development, right? And they are technically savvy. It just has to sort of sit in as something that they want to really make happen, especially in the case of a poly crisis, like you mentioned, where information will actually have to move between different actors rapidly and decisions will have to be made. So having a common language or specifications, which we talk about, is really helpful to achieve what you've just mentioned as some of the key challenges.
Yeah, I think, a big question for me is, what role is our finance ministries and finance departments going to take in, data governance in their jurisdictions?
Absolutely.
Finance ministry is both a provider and a consumer of data. I think it can do a lot more on its own end. And Avani mentioned the chart of accounts. There's a lot of potential for countries to kind of clean those up, get them more unified across different tiers of government. But they also need to be careful not to standardize things that shouldn't be standardized. Where is standardization appropriate, and where can you build flexibility on top of those standards as well? So yeah, and I think finance ministry's role in terms of holding accountable other providers of data and setters of data standards is also potentially a big area.
Yeah, it's almost as if they can take the lead on building the roads between different agencies to have information pass at the right time to the right person. Yeah.
But one issue is that, particularly in lower income countries, everybody has ideas about, what needs to be done, and everyone is kind of beating the same path to the finance ministry. The finance ministry needs to do this. The finance ministry needs to do that. The finance, and they only have so much bandwidth. So I think, maybe convincing them to hold others accountable for what they need to do, rather than the finance ministry continuously trying to kind of fix problems, which often, in my experience, a finance ministry finds bad data in a sector, and then rather than work with that sector for them to do a better job, they just take the data and try to clean it up themselves. And then this leads to more duplication of more lists of everything, and a bigger mess.
Thanks, Cathal. And I think I saw both Avani and Lorena nodding towards the end of those remarks. So let me first invite Avani back in if there's something in the recent remarks that you want to comment on, and then Lorena after.
No, just to say, I was thinking as Cathal, as you were saying this problem that almost every report says data discrepancy. I'm sure I think all of our reports say that as well. But I was also thinking about the fact that in India, the terms of reference of the 16th Finance Commission is out. And inevitably, if you see Finance Commission reports struggling with lack of good quality data, their ability, they play such an important role in India, but their ability to actually take decisions or be able to justify their decisions is impaired by lack of quality data, both either data that is missing or data that just doesn't add up. So I think having an events-based approach as you presented today could really help in solving that. Another area that as Cathal was speaking, I was thinking about the number of issues, especially in a country like India again, where we've been doing some work on trying to look at tribal health financing, for instance. There is no way of actually tracking that. And part of the problem is money, of course, is fungible and pooled. And so when you don't have an events-based system and you don't have those checkpoints to actually be able to know this is where this money is coming from, or this is what this money is meant to be for, it's impossible to actually trying to decode that or disaggregate that backwards. So yeah. So I think that's something that came to mind as you were speaking about just the dearth of data, despite having tons of data, which is always the dichotomy in most of our countries.
Thanks, Avani. Lorena?
So on this aspect, what is the role of ministries of finance on standardizing the data? Actually, a lot of the bandwidth of the ministries of finance goes in cleaning the data or not actually having the full data. So if we could actually invest in how we better capture this data, then we can free some of this bandwidth so that we can actually reallocate our resources for a better analysis of the data and modernize the way we think about this. It's not just about the reports, but what we are doing with the data for decision making. We can look at examples of countries that have done this. And Avani was mentioning before in her remarks, this thing of harmonizing accounting. And several countries, federal countries, have gone through this process. It's not an easy process, but it's possible. There are examples, and the other thing is how do we build the links once we have this harmonized accounting, and you harmonize the events, which has been done in other countries. The flow of data can be harmonized. You don't have to mandate the same system. One thing we're working on cost accounting with a country, with Brazil. How do you do more with data of cost accounting without the Ministry of Finance having to transform the data of all the ministries? Well, then you standardize the way you have to receive the data, which is actually very similar to what IFEX is aiming at. So you don't tell them how to do their systems, their administrative systems. You tell them how they have to send you the data. So in this way, there are ways that you can go around this and actually gather the data from the inputs that you need for decision making without having to make the Ministry of Finance the overall storage of data, which is honestly not feasible. It would be very costly. You would end up duplicating. So there are ways in which you can also have the data governance in which you have these layers. But these layers have some structure that can be observed. So, yeah, there are references from around the world in complex contexts. The levels in India can be complex, but anyways, my point here is there are ways to go about it. And Avani was making a very good mention on this, on harmonizing accounting across those governments. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and also linking to something that Cathal was mentioning on climate change and how this, the extensions of the chart of accounts. So this is a less explored topic because we talk about these functional level, administrative level, and how to harmonize this. Now, once we have these harmonized, we can create these extensions that allow us analyzing the data with different lenses. So Avani was mentioning, oh, well, but departments are not per se a budget execution agency or department, so they don't have this budget allocated to them. Well, these extensions allow us doing those kind of things and analyzing the budget with different lenses. We have done that for SDG budgeting. We do that with green budgeting. We do that with gender budgeting. So there are ways in which once we have different types of data, we can also tweak it without making something that needs to be a rigid codes and catalogs that everyone needs to follow this for for greening and creating this huge complex structure. It can actually be a flexible way of doing this.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lorena. And I think we might not be using the same language exactly, but we're definitely thinking around, again, what could one include into such kind of either specifications or chart of accounts, or the way that this information is transmitted, that would enable that level of disaggregation, tagging, reaggregation as well. So definitely something we're interested in exploring further. We are close to the scheduled time we had for this webinar. I do want to check quickly with the panelists how y'all are placed. Would another 5 to 7 minutes be okay? Okay, I see nods. So we'll request the audience to put in any questions they have in the Q&A. While they're doing that, I'm going to start us off. Well, I actually have only one question. Any of y'all are welcome to jump in on this. The question is that as we worked on this, we found working on standardizing fiscal events and fiscal information, while complicated, there were still clear sources we could look at in terms of how that information is supposed to be exchanged between different actors within government or anyone who's interacting with government. When we start thinking about pairing that with information from delivery side systems, right? So people who are actually responsible for delivering the services, whether that's a district or department, or a particular hospital for that matter. How should we think about standardization? Are there sources that we can go to sort of get a jump start on that process? Again, big question, but welcome your thoughts. Too big a question?
So, you know, I think we're kind of thinking about the systems that are used to deliver services. So, like, we're thinking about things like registration systems, and you know, and therefore we're thinking about registers, whether they be like registers of schools or registers of hospitals, or even a register of local governments. I have found that, you know, these registers tend to have a lot of discrepancies in them across different departments. So, like, even in something like the education management information system, the registry of schools may look different between the planning department in the Ministry of Education, which is responsible for budgeting, and the exam board, where, you know, we start to find results on outputs and outcomes. So then afterwards, when you're trying to bring together data on, like, the effectiveness of spending across, you know, local governments or schools and things like that, it becomes difficult to match up these different sources of data. So, you know, I think in thinking about how, you know, how the PFM system becomes part of a wider architecture of data and platforms, I think we need to think about the foundational parts of it, which are these registers. And we need to think about the people who are in charge of those registers, who are registrars, and how, you know, easy or not it is for them to do their job, and, you know, what kind of accountability structures need to be in place to make sure that they are kind of managing data that is, very much in the public interest.
So if I make a very quick announcement, because we're about to publish in the next coming months an analytical paper on how the futures of cost accounting. So it goes exactly to that. How do we bring administrative registries up to the Ministry of Finance to create cost accounting? When we used to think about cost accounting before, it was recreating the cost centers, which are the schools, the hospitals, the districts, that are not exactly in the budget allocations per se, but rather they are they're called cost centers, right? How do we bring that up without the Ministry of Finance having to replicate that in all the ways? And actually, part of what we are proposing is how we can do that with just doing levels of cost centers, so that it can actually, you can bring back the information or the data through APIs without having to actually mandate how each ministry needs to do their cost centers. So what you harmonize is the levels that they're going to tag. And you can have 3 levels, you can have 4 levels because different ministries might need different levels, or different sectors might need different levels. So this is a way where you might not be able to standardize the way they're developing their systems, or because you don't want to. What you want to get is the actual data in the way that you need it to do analysis, right? So if we abstract ourselves from that, what is it exactly that we need, right? So we're doing it with levels. We find a way of doing that. We're actually developing a machine learning model on how to use data after that for performance budgeting, for improving budget credibility. So for actual outcomes, for example, in procurement and stuff. So the levels is what we found as a good chain that allows us to do this.
Great, thanks, Lorena.
There's just one question, a couple of questions actually on the chat. So let me just quickly sum that up. The first one is, how can we think of standards in terms of better service delivery for anyone, if any of the panelists would like to chip in with their views on that? And the second one is, given the varying efforts that are going on around standardization or essentially information flow, is there a view from any of the panelists on how can we synergize these efforts? How can we sort of collaborate best to look at one possible outcome that all of us are working towards? Yeah.
I think I'll just come in with just my 2 cents, which is, I was thinking about your previous question as well, and I tend to veer towards what Lorena said, which is, I don't think everything has to be completely standardized, because that's where I've had people pushing back even in suggestions of standardizing accounting heads, because what happens to the decentralized nature of our country? Not saying I always agree with all the criticism, sometimes I do, but I think that if you think about it more in terms of what is the end goal, which I think everyone agrees on, if we can standardize some level of coding and tagging, without mandating how everything should happen, I think that's where we could actually go a lot further. It allows you to zoom out and zoom in as you desire, without saying you have to have 20 levels and each one has to follow this process and everything has to be collected in this manner. I don't think that would necessarily work in a country as diverse and decentralized as India, and I don't even think it needs to. Because our end goal is not to create a universal standard template. It's about, like, as we're all saying, better service delivery. So I think that's where I would go.
Thank you.
Maybe just to offer a kind of answers from elsewhere, and building what Avani was talking about. Yes, it can't. Not every sector and service the government provides is the same, obviously, and it can't all be kind of measured or standardized in the same way. I mean, I've posted a link to Mark Robinson's blog, and he's just had a recent series of 3 blogs kind of on digitalization and performance measurement or monitoring and evaluation. And he's quite bullish on the potential of digitalization, but also notes like some limitations where like it's difficult in some sectors to measure the quality of outputs, and very difficult to get at outcomes unless you do surveys, and that's something separate to administrative systems. But I think it's useful to kind of think through where there are kind of commonalities and sectors where you can kind of measure outputs and the quality of those outputs as well.
Great, thanks, Cathal. Lorena, yeah, last word.
And if I may, just in that, before we were talking about, when I say before, it's not this webinar, but rather like 12 years ago, when we were talking about performance budgeting and these outputs, it was all about how do we create a perfect system to capture everything. Now technology allows us to think about this differently. Now we don't need to create a system where we capture all the indicators. We can have a plethora of data sources and different ways of drilling down, like Avani was saying. So instead, you can have the indicators where they do their inputs directly, the ministries, like it's the only source of data. Okay, it's there. You can have some that come from administrative records where you get the overall indicator, you have your methodology in there, you get the global, but then you can drill down because you are connected via API to the administrative records and you go there. Then you have from your national statistical office, and you don't have to recreate the indicator, you can be pulling from there. So one thing that we were, knowing Mike Robinson very well since 2012 when we were talking about performance budgeting, honestly, technology has evolved in a way that we need to also rethink the way we source data. And we can do things different than we were doing them in many ways. Yeah, those are my.
Great. Thanks, Lorena. So on that note, also, because we've overshot our time, I'm going to try to quickly summarize 4 or 5 key points that stood out to me from the discussion, with apologies in advance if I missed something that you were covering as well. It's just the nature of trying to pack it all into 4 or 5. One is, I think I heard everyone say that more digitalization is happening, and not just more digitalization, but to the point Lorena was just making, a different kind, or at least potentially a different kind. And so when we think about trends in digitalization of government and government systems, if we approach this thinking about interoperability, rather than creating one giant data store that has everything all of the time, which is not possible, there actually are new possibilities that lie in front of us. And we certainly find that exciting. The second point, I think Cathal made this most succinctly, but it was part of the context for all of us, is that the overall fiscal space is smaller. And what that means is that efficiency matters a lot. Being able to secure better results for what you spend matters a lot. But at the same time, equity in terms of targeting and reaching specific populations also matters a lot. And I'm building up to something with this, but before I get there, the third point again was that we live and work in federal systems, at least in many countries we do. And that federalism is an important part of the design of the system. It matters for how policy is designed and how it's delivered. Subsidiarity matters to a considerable extent, because if we want local responsiveness, and we're saying governments have to be more responsive, then really managing that balance of autonomy and control and subsidiarity is the only way that it's going to happen. And if I put together these two ideas, right, you want more efficiency, you want more equity, you want more subsidiarity. We are in a space very familiar to the policy analyst, which is to say we need more and better disaggregated data. But having started with like a very simplistic slide, I think there is actually a lot of development, a lot of innovation, and really a more profound understanding of what disaggregate data can mean and how it can come into being. I should say one of the organizations that gave us, again, very helpful feedback on the draft was the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, CBGA in India. And they've been doing really impressive work recombining some of the information that we have and putting it together at the constituency level. To say for a parliamentary constituency or a legislative assembly constituency, this is the corresponding expenditures on different areas of development or different heads, right? And it's taken really hard work and innovative work from them to do it. But I think we can be inspired from things like that and say, is it possible to make many such views, many such drill downs possible, either by default or at least for certain actors who need them, possible with fewer steps and lesser effort. The last point I think that came up was around really thinking about the role of finance ministries in all of this. And I think I heard the panelists say that it's not so much about every single request being channeled to the finance ministry saying the finance ministry should do something about it, but rather how finance ministries can play a role in creating better governance around, especially around data and data exchange. And then I think to the point Cathal was making, right, rather than trying to recreate it, enable the particular actor in that space to actually either develop their systems or at least develop how they share data in ways that make it more usable. The final point, which really resonated with us. So my colleague Gautam and I wrote a paper a bit over a year ago talking about how digital platforms, DPI, stuff like Digit, stuff like iFix, can play a key role in enhancing state capacity, not necessarily by creating capacity, but by reducing the amount of time and effort spent on relatively low value things, right? And so when you talk about the amount of time that people have to spend on cleaning data before they can use it for decision making, right? My ears perk up. I'm like, this is exactly what a digital platform can do. It can potentially save people from having to spend a lot of their time and effort on relatively low value things, and in turn effectively free up that capacity for things like policy making, for things like actually ensuring last mile delivery of services, for things like actually thinking about, wait, what is the link between this output and the outcomes that we want? And so on that note, let me again thank all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you, Lorena. Thank you, Avani. Thank you, Cathal. Thank you also to all of our attendees. We hope that you found the session interesting and informative, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ameya. Thank you, Prashant.
Thank you.